You can fix a broken economy. You can cut taxes and sort out public finance. You can remove regulation, and you can even remove yourself from the European Union. Once you allow mass demographic change, you change the human capital and the underlying essence of what it means to be British. And I would put it to you that that is a catastrophic failure.
Now, you've written a fantastic piece in a newspaper all about how to solve Britain's many, many problems. And you delve into all sorts of solutions to problems ranging from immigration to the economy. If you could name the worst policy failure that Britain has undertaken in the last 20 or 30 years, what would it be?
Mass immigration and multiculturalism. You can fix a broken economy. You can cut taxes and sort out public finance. You can remove regulation, and you can even remove yourself from the European Union. Once you allow mass demographic change, you change the human capital and the underlying essence of what it means to be British. And I would put it to you that that is a catastrophic failure. All governments since 1997 have presided over a mass influx of people. They have presided over a mass influx of people in the mistaken fantasy belief that it is good for the economy. There is nothing good about importing people with low cognitive ability, low aptitude, low skill levels, and a high propensity to live on welfare and commit criminal offences. They've made a big mistake in believing that mass immigration was good for the economy when it's not. It's actually lowered Britain's per capita income. The second fantasy under which they deluded us was that somehow multiculturalism was a stable or desirable or sustainable position to be in. It's not. The reason why Britain has been a success is because of a distinctly Anglo-Celtic culture, a British culture. It is essentially Western, and importing people who don't share those values has actually diminished and undermined our great virtues and our great strengths. So immigration is the number one failing. Just to put it in context, today in Britain, 1 in every 27 people has arrived in the past 24 months. The demography of London, the city of my birth, has transformed since 1991. There are now only 7 boroughs in London where white British people are not a minority. This is a massive transformation, and all major parties are culpable and guilty of this catastrophic failure.
On so many of the issues that you talk about in your article, there seems to have been a cross-party consensus over the last 30 years, and immigration is a perfect example of that. Particularly when it comes to illegal and legal migration, it seems like politicians on both sides of the aisle just don't have the political will to deal with this or to want to reduce immigration. The Conservatives argue it's good for the economy, Labour the same, and it seems that nothing can change. When it comes to deporting tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of illegal migrants in Britain, and closing our borders to legal migrants, is this actually possible? Because the Conservatives claim, or some Conservative politicians have claimed in the past, that they were not able to do this in government. It was basically an impossible task.
Well, there are several things to unpack in this. I mean, first of all, don't believe that it's impossible. There's nothing inviolate about the rules on immigration. They are rules that are made by people, or should be made by people democratically accountable to us. It is perfectly possible to undo the damage, but the longer that the damage persists, the harder it will be. It would have been great if we had acted 15 years ago when there was a Conservative majority government. Sadly, the Conservatives in office have behaved much like Labour in office, and that's because they're both basically Blairite. We've had a Blairite establishment running the country for the past 30 years. Blair was elected with a massive majority in 1997, although he himself was only in office for about a decade. In the intervening 28 years, we've had a series of governments of all three parties that share the Blairite assumption, which is that human nature is interchangeable, that people are interchangeable, that an Eritrean can become an Englishman and an Englishman can become an Eritrean. This is palpable nonsense. They also believe that our rights, our liberties are handed to us by charters, by supranational conventions, by judicial activism. This has created a lethal combination. It basically means that we have ministers that, even when ministers want to act tough on immigration, and David Blunkett talked tough about immigration when he was Home Secretary, and Boris Johnson, believe it or not, was elected talking tough about controlling our borders, taking back control of our borders. Keir Starmer has been talking about taking action to stop the mass influx of illegal young men crossing the English Channel. None of them can do it because the administrative state over which they notionally and only notionally preside doesn't want to do it and isn't equipped to do it, ultimately because it takes its orders from a judiciary that doesn't want to act. So that is not to say that it can't be done. What it is to say is that the people we currently have in office and have chosen to elect can't do it, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. So when I wrote Milestones, I was really asking the question, what is it we need to do to change not just the government of Britain, but the way that Britain is governed in order to get these outcomes? And I came up with a series of proposals, A, to tackle judicial activism, to rein in judicial review, which is a new concept that has limited the ability of those we elect to actually control our borders. But I get to the heart of the issue, which is that we need remigration. Now, I've become familiar with the word. Some people will find it shocking, but remigration means removing from the West non-Western people who live here and don't wish to adopt the Western way of life. Remigration, first of all, needs to be applied to those who've entered the country illegally. Now, we have between 1 million and 500,000 people living in Britain illegally. The United States has shown in the past 3 months, where they've deported about 50,000 people a month, that it is perfectly possible to round up people who are in the country unlawfully and remove them. In the case of the United States, when there was one individual who they tried to return to South Sudan and the government of South Sudan refused to take him, they cancelled all visas from South Sudan. Quick about turn from the government of South Sudan. Britain should take a similar approach. We should deport all illegal people who are in the country illegally to the country from which they originate. If necessary, you can use a DNA test to establish from where it is they come if they're not willing to cooperate. And if the government of that country, Eritrea or Ethiopia or Nigeria or wherever it is, won't take them, then you simply cancel all the visas from that country until they come to their senses. This can be done, and America is doing it, and Britain needs to do it. But this is not just about the million or so people living in the country illegally. A significant number of people have come to the country quite legally and are living on welfare. Despite what we were told about the benefits of mass immigration, there's good evidence from the Netherlands that shows that people from non-Western countries, particularly Muslim countries who live in the Netherlands, are throughout the course of their lives, careers I was going to say, but many of them sadly don't seem to have careers. Through the course of their lives, they're a net burden on the Dutch taxpayer. We need to apply an assessment, a public interest test. And if you have entered the country as a foreign national, however legally, and you're a net burden on the country, we need to create the mechanism for your removal. And we shouldn't hold back in doing this. There's nothing shameful about this. There's no God-given right that you have to come here and live on our welfare system. And if you're doing so, you must be removed. But then we need to go a step further, Stephen. We need to be prepared to remove people from the country who've been born in Britain, but who want Sharia law. I don't think that people quite understand the gravity of the situation. If you are a Blairite, you believe that the first and second and third generation who arrive in the West will look at the West and gradually assimilate to the West. Now, in most cases, that's true, and notably people from Hindu backgrounds in India, Indian origin, very, very great record of assimilation. People from Western backgrounds. I know there are a lot of people from Malta who came into the country in the 1950s. I would challenge anyone to spot any difference between the lifestyles of their great-grandkids and those of people whose great-grandparents were born in Britain. But there is an issue to do with Muslim assimilation. And it goes to the heart of, I think, some of the metaphysical beliefs of Islam. And if people from Muslim backgrounds are not willing to accept certain prerequisites for being a citizen in the West, then I think we need the mechanism to take away their citizenship. If they believe in anti-Semitic dogma, they should be removed. I noticed that in the United States this week, they have just changed the rules so that if you have exhibited anti-Semitic behavior, you will be denied a visa, lose your visa, and lose your residency rights. We need a similar approach. If you are maybe even a second or third generation Briton, but you believe that people who abandon their faith shouldn't have the freedom of belief and must be put to death for abandoning their faith, then I think you must also lose your British nationality, your British passport, because you're not really British, are you? You're just you're a foreigner living under Britain's passport of convenience. And I think we need to amend the 1981 Nationality Act to strip you of your citizenship and remove you. And I think the sooner this is done, the better. I think the argument for doing it is now unanswerable. The question is, when will we get a government willing to do it? The city of my birth, London, is now a majority non-British. I notice that parts of Britain that are vibrant and multicultural, like Birmingham, having imported large numbers of people from the third world, now resemble the third world. I don't want the rest of the country of my birth to become like that. We don't have to put up with this. There's nothing inevitable about multiculturalism. It doesn't work. It clearly doesn't work. People who don't want to assimilate to British culture, to Western culture, to a better way of life, are free to live as they want, but they must do so elsewhere. I think this is now widely accepted by the majority of people in Britain. It's now widely articulated on new media programs. We now need a government willing to do it.
Nigel Farage has been incredibly outspoken against a lot of what you just said, particularly on stripping citizenship from British citizens. And obviously Rupert Lowe has been more on your side of the argument. There's been a bit of a split in the Reform Party. When it comes to testing the values of some of these people that you want to remove citizenship for, how does one go about that practically? How do you test whether someone really wants to kill people because they leave Islam or whatever? And do you think that being a British citizen or having a British passport is innately linked with what some people call British values? This idea of what it means to be British and having certain beliefs as a British person.
Again, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, on the issue of Nigel versus Rupert, I'm not going to get involved in that. Huge admirer of both people. Nigel, I think, has got this heroic quality to him for all his flaws. He's human. I think we must almost acknowledge the fact that he's been prepared on many occasions to stand up for the country against enormous personal animus, and he's often been right. I say that because I'm also going to say that Nigel sometimes isn't right first time. I noticed that, for example, over lockdowns, he was quite supportive of draconian lockdowns, but he then realized somewhat later than others that it was the wrong policy and he modified. And I suspect he's in a similar position when it comes to the mass deportation of Muslims. He's not currently there yet, but I think he will get there. I think the way to persuade someone's mind and get them to change their mind is to try and persuade them, not to hector and bully them. I have no doubt that Nigel will end up pretty much where I am rather rapidly. I suspect actually at the next election you will have left-wing Labour MPs going into the election offering deportation. These ideas are mainstream. They're what the country wants. They will happen. The question is who credibly has the plan to deliver, and that's why I wrote Milestones, in order to come up with the granular detail of how you achieve this. British values. There's been no shortage of Blairite politicians, notably Gordon Brown, who've pontificated about British values. And when you ask them what British values mean, they normally say it means fair play. Oh, find me a country that says they don't believe in fair play. Or they mean the rule of law. Find me a country where people say, do you know what? We don't believe in the rule of law here. Or they'll say, it's eating cucumber sandwiches and the parading around Buckingham Palace. Forgive me, I don't really want such twee emblems of identity. I think there is something distinctly British with British values, and they're not encapsulated by any of those verbose cliches. The first thing to understand is that there is something distinctively Western. The West is a product of three strands of thought. One is Athenian, the idea of the Greek philosophers, which is that you can interpret and make sense of the world through reason. This was a radical and revolutionary idea. The second pillar of Western thought is from Jerusalem, an essentially Jewish inheritance about the nature of God and of man being made in the image of God. And this is really important. It's not a theological point. Well, it is a theological point, but it's really, really important today. If you believe that the divine being and that we're each made in the image of the divine being, it imbues on each individual a dignity and a status and an autonomy that is not universal. The third pillar informing Western thought is Roman, the sort of Roman concept of law, and I would say a sort of echo in Roman thought of Greek philosophy too. Why am I elaborating on this? Well, because I want to make the point that Islam rejects the essentially Athenian idea that you can understand the world through reason. Early on in the expansion of Islam, Islam came across Athenian, what they call Hellenistic ideas, Hellenistic philosophy. And initially, early Islam incorporated some of these Athenian ideas of philosophy into their worldview. But between the 9th and the 13th century, Islam decisively rejected the idea that you could have revelation through reason. They came to the conclusion, on the contrary, that reason was somehow a threat to revelation and that revelation should be above reason. And they rejected reason. This explains why from the 13th century you've had no great advances in science in Islam. This explains why Spain today, not a country known for its great literary tradition, translates more books into Spanish every year than Islam, Muslim Arab world has translated in the past century. So I go into this detail not so much to define British culture, although I'm happy to go on and define that, but first of all to define Western culture. Western culture is very distinctive and very specific. And if you import into the West a large numbers of people who are informed by the Wahhabi tradition, or if perhaps not that extreme, the Asharite tradition, which rejects the idea that reason can make sense of the world, you are creating a real and a catastrophic clash of civilizations. This is why there are many people in Britain today of a Muslim background who want Sharia law. This is why there are significant numbers of Muslims who don't seem to apply rational discourse of cause and effect in the scientific world or everyday current affairs. It explains why there's such a high incidence in Middle East newspapers and journalism of conspiracy theories. These are deep-seated, fundamental, profound cultural differences. If you don't accept and recognize that there is something distinctive about Western culture, and you import people from outside that tradition in the belief that they can assimilate without being aware of these things, it's not just the Middle East that the West has failed to democratize. We're not even getting basic democratic norms and standards from second and third generation Britons that we've imported from the Middle East, because we have the same naivety that we displayed in our foreign policy and our domestic policy in believing in the compatibility of the incompatible. Now, I don't want to stop there. I would like, if I may, to define what within the branch of Western civilization is distinctively British. I'm going to say distinctively English. My apologies to any Scottish listeners. I think within the Western tradition, there is something distinctive about English culture. English culture, English political culture and philosophical culture certainly, I think, is distinctive in its idea of liberty. England gave the world the idea that those who make the law should be accountable to those who live under it. It perhaps goes back to Anglo-Saxon tradition, the tradition of the moot hall. Even kings were subject to the laws of the collective. So I think England invented liberty and gave rise to the idea of liberty. And England's great gift to the world was, I think, liberty and the common law. And that is distinct. I think England also gave rise to the idea of skepticism, the idea that we should be somewhat more skeptical of the grand rationalist designs that you traditionally see in continental Europe. So I'm digressing slightly, but number one, there is something very distinctively Western as opposed to Muslim. I think within the Western mindset and Western culture, there is something distinctively English, although one could sort of elaborate at even greater length on that. It's extraordinary that we've been governed by people for 30 years who've got away with grotesque platitudes about British values, which they ultimately don't really know how to define them. Let's have this conversation. Let's define British values. The more we define British and Western values, the more obvious it is that not all cultures are the same.
I want to move on from this topic and just focus on some other parts of the article that is really interesting. You talk about reforming the British state in order to enact various policies. Again, we're going back to the argument that many Conservatives have made over the last 14 years. Oh, we couldn't do this because of the civil service, or oh, we couldn't do this because of some Blairite legislation, or some quango, or some committee, or some judge, or whatever. And the Conservatives consistently made the argument that it wasn't their fault that they got nothing done, or that they did the exact opposite as to what they promised. It was all these other people's responsibility. Can we talk a bit about some of the solutions that you perhaps give to that problem? So you talk about creating the Department of the Prime Minister. You talk about shutting down around a third of the government departments, kind of Javier Milei style. Can you go through some of the almost revolutionary acts that you want to commit in the next kind of radical right government?
It's a puzzle. When I stood down from Parliament, I went and talked to a number of Blair-era civil servants and ministers because I was intrigued. Blair had a pretty solid majority and yet would complain about the lack of delivery. And he set up a delivery unit in Number 10, and he was constantly harping on about delivery and frustrations he had. And I noticed that something similar happened when you had Conservatives in office. And I began to build up a picture that really the Prime Minister presides over a vast bureaucracy that's essentially dysfunctional. And he can issue press releases. He can create the illusion of activity and results. But often ministers will pull at levers that are disconnected. They will jab at buttons that don't light up to anything. And I think this is because the people that we elect to govern us preside over a bureaucracy that doesn't really answer to them anymore. It answers to itself. You've got a triumvirate of dysfunction at the heart of Downing Street, where you've got Downing Street as a unit, you've got the Cabinet Office next to it as a unit, and you've got the Treasury across the street as a distinct entity. And really, what you need, I think, is a Department of the Prime Minister in place of that strategic dysfunction and division to give coherence. And I came up with this plan for a Department of the Prime Minister so that you could actually bring together the things you need to bring together to deliver the outcomes you want. Remember how the Conservatives passed legislation to deport people who had entered the country illegally to Rwanda. They were unable to make this happen because of the dysfunctional nature of the centre of the machine. If you create a Department of the Prime Minister, you could create the fiat, the drive necessary to get things done. And you could overcome the inertia and the intentional resistance, it has to be said, from the administrative state. So that was one thing. I don't think it's just enough to create a Department of the Prime Minister. You fundamentally need to get rid of some of the bureaucracy that you've got. You've got too many government departments. They say they're trying to do too much, but many of them, I think, just exist in order to sustain the people on their payroll. I recommended closing about a third of government departments. That would save about 30 billion a year. Some of the residual functions would need to go to other departments, but you could get rid of, as Argentina's done, a vast number of government departments, about 1 in 3.
Which ones?
But that's I off the top of my head, the Department of Energy, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. I've got a comprehensive list. If you look at my Substack, Google it, Milestones Carswell Substack, you'll get the detailed list. And I went through with a detailed budget for each one, how much of the money that they currently cost us, you would need to still spend because you would need to pass that function to another department, what the savings would be. It was a sort of serious exercise in closing down 8 out of 24 government departments. But it's not enough, Stephen, just to have a department of the Prime Minister and to close down the dysfunctional departments that already exist. You also need to use what Trump has done in America. You need to use prime ministerial fit. Now, in Britain, you can't get a prime minister to sign an executive order, but they can sign something remarkably similar that's seldom ever been used, called an order in council, where the crown prerogative, these are the powers constitutionally reserved for the monarch, where they still apply, and they apply in things like foreign relations, control of our borders, immigration, setting visa quota numbers, fast tracking deportations, where you can apply orders in council, we should do so. And an incoming government should have ready, as Trump did, a series of orders in council ready to go to drive forward some of the changes we need, particularly when it comes to control of immigration and control of the civil service. So there's a lot that can be done. But one thing I would urge any reform leader or conservative leader or MPs not to do is to do what Liz Truss did, to do what Boris Johnson did, to do what they all did, which is win the election and then walk into government without a clear agenda, and to have the civil servants basically control everything they do. That is what I wrote Milestones to try to avoid doing. If we don't go in with a future centre-right government with a clear agenda as to how to change the civil service and tackle the judges, we will vote Conservative, we will vote Reform, but we will end up with another Blairite administration.
I'm sure that some would argue that your article is fairly similar to what the Conservatives tried to do. So Liz Truss obviously wanted to deregulate, slash taxes. Dominic Cummings, maybe he had some of your reforms in mind when it came to the civil service. And when it comes to immigration, they all say that they want to cut immigration. So how do you kind of differ from the previous few Conservative administrations?
Now, don't get me wrong, Dominic and Liz Truss are very, very good after the fact at explaining the problem. They learnt firsthand what happens if you go into number 10 and don't have a plan. The reason I wrote Milestones was precisely to avoid the mistake they made of not knowing how to defang the civil service and overcome the judiciary. So I wanted to be specific. I mean, listening to Dominic, he's very, very good at explaining, as is Liz, very, very good at explaining how impossible it is to get things done by the civil service as it's currently configured. Okay, fine, we get that, we know that, we've heard that, we've seen that play out. Milestones comes out with a detailed list of steps you take preemptively to stop that from happening again. And I don't think either Dominic or Liz had come up with that level of granular detail. In fact, I know they hadn't, because at the time that Boris won his majority in 2019, some of us had prepared a ready-made blueprint for him with many of these ideas and presented it to the incoming administration, and they didn't act. Now, they would tell you today they were unable to act because of COVID. Actually, they lost interest in these things well before COVID. So unlike what Boris and Dominic and Liz have done, this is a detailed instruction manual of what you do to avoid their sorry fate.
One argument in their favour is that the Conservative Party, as it was constituted in Parliament, would never have voted in favour of any of your reforms because only about 10 Conservative MPs were actually Conservative. But maybe you can comment on that. But my final question is about the US. I want you to compare the two different directions of America and Britain at the moment. America under Donald Trump, Britain under Keir Starmer. Do you see those countries diverging in all the sort of topics that you're talking about, whether it's immigration, the economy, regulations, and so on?
I mean, the United States is certainly charting a distinctive course. The United States, I think, was in perilous danger of basically ending up as a sort of giant version of California. Sclerotic, intrusive government, micro-regulations. The progressive ascendancy in America, I think, had they won the presidential election, would have fundamentally changed the nature of America. You would have seen higher taxes, federal intrusion. The election of Trump 2.0, I think, is a significant watershed in America. They've changed course. They are finally getting to grips with with sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion dogma in universities. They're finally getting a grip on federal spending. Some of the things that DOGE has been uncovering is quite extraordinary. They're finally, I think, getting to grips with many of the things that I think were ailing America. And I think if they get this right, it's going to put America, I'm still very optimistic, despite the dramas over tariffs, I'm still very, very optimistic about America. I think the changes that you're seeing under this administration will lead to ever greater productivity growth in America. I think the AI productivity gains are just about to kick in. America still has to address some far-reaching problems. It's budget deficit, I think, number one. It's huge debt. I think America has real problems with geopolitical overstretch, and there's some sign that they are beginning to address that. There's some real rethink about defense procurement reform. These are problems that can be solved, and I think are being solved. And I think America, they might not get it right first time, but I think the reformists under this administration, I think, will achieve a great deal in 4 years that will leave America in a much, much better shape, much stronger. Now, yes, in a way, they're diverging from the rest of the West. But I think the gravitational pull of America means that Britain is going to follow. There's been tremendous interest in what the conservatives in America are doing. I think British conservatives realize the dire condition of the country, and I think are beginning to inch their way towards a sort of milestones type agenda. I think fundamentally, America will save the old world by example in a way that America previously saved the old world by military force. I think Britain will follow America's lead, and I think Europe will too. I suspect that in Europe they will phase out some of the draconian regulations on things like data protection, et cetera, that have held back the European economy. They will do it grudgingly, but they will only do it because America is still the shining city on the hill. America is the example for the world to follow. And I think, it doesn't always look that way, particularly if you rely on the BBC and CNN for your information about America. But I think America is heading in the right direction, and the rest of the West will follow.